we're not going to solve cost in healthcare without knowing the incentives that drive the flow of money. And once you figure that out around a use case, then you have a chance to actually affect it, or you actually have a chance to, having understood it, say, well, that's not going to change. Let's not waste our time and money there.
Why is this space just so dang hard for these big companies that have endless resources? Why are we not seeing more from big tech?
This is Second Opinion. I'm Christina Farr.
I'm Ash Sanuz. And I'm Luba Greenwood.
Welcome to the pod, where each week we navigate what's really going on in healthcare through strikingly candid conversations with the entrepreneurs and investors leading the charge. As your co-hosts, we promise to bring the perspective of a former journalist and investor, a doctor, a lawyer, immersed in the future of medicine with life sciences and digital health.
And we're here to set the signal from the noise in all of these conversations. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Make sure you stick around at the end of the interview for our debrief.
We are back for another episode of Second Opinion. So good to be here with Luba, my co-host and partner in crime, and then Sumit Nagpal, who is joining us from a company called Cherish Health, which is in the hardware space. We have not seen many hardware companies yet on the podcast. But the idea is you put one of his devices in the home and it tracks a lot of potential issues that could come up from a health perspective for seniors, but then also things like fall detection. You both know this topic better than anyone. Luba, you having worked at Verily for a number of years. It's actually when we met. You were at Verily at the time. Between the three of us, we've got a lot to talk about. So I'm going to kick off a question to both of you, which is just, why is this space just so dang hard for these big companies that have endless resources? And you look at some of these startups that we're backing and, you know, they've got a few $1 million and managing to somehow kind of make it work and have some traction. So why are we not seeing more from big tech?
The biggest challenge that big tech faces entering healthcare, when they try to be healthcare companies, not when they try to be themselves, but when they try to be healthcare companies, is just how fundamentally different the business models are in healthcare and how long it takes to actually establish credentials and start generating revenue and actually have a business. And by the time that happens, the earnings calls have already happened where the outflow of money with no results is starting to really eat at the senior execs on those calls. And pretty soon, one or two earnings calls later, someone has to pull the plug on the program. That's the pattern that they all follow.
Yeah.
And it's all about trying to do things in an industry that requires tremendous amounts of experience and perhaps decades of being in the field. Trying to replicate that within a public company context is the real challenge. They just don't have the time to get there. And of course, startups don't have the public company overhang. They don't have the capital. They don't have the scale, but they can move fast and they can break stuff and they can get things done without actually having to explain giant quantities of money flowing out red ink on an earnings call that just becomes the thing that kills these projects. The cycle continues. You know, some company like Google is exiting, or Walmart, as you've seen, is exiting a space, and someone else like Best Buy is coming in by buying a whole piece of, healthcare capability. And the cycle seems to be 4 years. And year 2 or year 3 is when those earnings calls get really hard. And then years 3 and 4 are where they exit. That seems to be the pattern.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. It is interesting that you have noted that there is basically a 4-year cycle when companies talk about it, and there's a lot of excitement. The biggest issue that I have seen in addition to that is a lot of the tech companies are trying to solve a very large problem without basically forgetting that they themselves initially started with answering and fixing a small problem. When you're Amazon, you started with books. When you're Google, you try to perfect and have a better search capabilities than others. And Apple also knows, their place. They started really with hardware and computers. And sometimes people forget that and they think, wow, we are going to bring big tech to solve a very difficult problem, but they don't even identify what that problem is. They just say tech and healthcare together is going to fix things. So that's one thing, is it's trying to bite off too much without focusing on what is the problem. The second piece is, once you define the problem you're going to solve, as a tech company, sometimes tech companies forget what are they good at and what can they bring into the solution. So one example, and why I love actually Sumit and would love to hear what you're doing, is you're going after more of a hardware. You've defined yourself that this is where you're bringing your value, the big value add. And of course, software is a big piece of it, but you also honed in on a big issue, big relatively in terms of its importance, but and narrow in terms of where you're going after, and your home monitoring, and recognizing that, especially as we have an aging population, that is where our medical need is. And that's where you can do not just improve outcomes, but also have enormous potential savings. So therefore, it makes sense as a business model. I usually bring in an example of Apple, who I think did a really fantastic job. They recognized who they are. They recognize that they are a device company. When they're looking into healthcare generally, they didn't say we're big tech, we're going after everything in tech. They said, so we make devices, we have hardware engineers, of course they have software engineers as well, but we're going to leverage our hardware capabilities to make a medical device. And hence they really succeeded and were one of the first, really, I think the first company that made a true wearable device that is a medical device. And they went through all the regulatory, which was not easy, and have paved a way to other medical and remote monitoring devices as well that can do continuous data gathering and information, but also providing that feedback. So I think when tech companies really hone in on what it is that they can do, what the solution that they can provide, and where their strength is, rather than going after everything, is key. And also, when I say their strength is not just where they have succeeded in terms of differentiation and building, for example, a product, but also recognizing what teams they can lead. So when you're building a healthcare product team, you already are bringing in software and hardware engineers together with scientists, together with physicians, clinicians, and healthcare providers. And, a lot of the times consultants from pairs as well. And the hardest thing is not knowing, are you going to really hone in on the software product or hardware product? And then within that, what solution you're providing. I would see that the biggest issue really is lack of focus, and sometimes too much money thrown in at a very, very large problem. So you can't really focus.
You've hit the nail on the head. The way I describe this, going back to my time at Accenture, my thesis was, in working with big tech in particular, my thesis was find the adjacency. Stay true to your strengths and find the adjacency. What is it that is 2 degrees off, 3 degrees off from what you already do really, really well, that you can do, where you can apply that to do one of two things: either massively take out cost or massively reduce hardship. Those two things, perhaps even both. If you can pull either of those off without becoming a healthcare company, without having this earnings call problem, then you're onto something. And so, of course, to your point, Apple found that adjacency. They made a watch. It's a consumer product. People are buying this, whether it has healthcare applications or not. And then the healthcare applications really started off with fitness applications, lifestyle stuff. And then gradually they grew that into this adjacency of healthcare, where some of their stuff winds up being used to do the kinds of medical monitoring that we all need, right? And that's exactly the thesis that I started my career at Accenture with. And we found incredible adjacencies for companies ranging from Apple to Google to Comcast to Best Buy, etc. The challenge is that those adjacencies somehow don't feel like healthcare. Those adjacencies feel, Apple will never describe themselves as a healthcare company.
I will push back on that though, Sumit, because I do remember Apple saying healthcare is the greatest contribution that we will make to mankind.
We agree.
So, but you're
We
right. They
agree.
didn't say healthcare company. They just said contribution.
Yeah.
But then
That's right.
that kind of dovetails into my next question, which I'm going to, pick on you both to ask, which is how much of this is just like billionaires getting older? Because I just, if you think about Apple, there's all this history around Steve Jobs getting sick, he got pancreatic cancer. They took out his pancreas. He got diabetes, and that really was, for a firsthand experience with just how hard it can be to prick your finger all day, and that made him want to go after the wearable space and this non-invasive glucose monitoring, which Apple's been trying to do for a long time, allegedly. And then you take, I think there's just plenty of other examples. Like Google definitely had some founders that were getting older and thinking about their own health. And same thing with Jeff Bezos. Like that was definitely part of why Amazon kicked this off. So curious how much you think there is, real strategy here, and a bunch of consultants kind of looking at the numbers and saying this is a big TAM, we should do it, versus like, here's a billionaire getting older and realizing that it sucks to get older.
Yeah, I'll give you an example from much closer in our own industry in healthcare IT. I had the privilege of being very close to Neil Patterson, the founder of Cerner, the CEO of Cerner. And in the early 20s, I had a conversation with him. We were doing a lot of work with them in Kansas City. And I had a conversation with him where I really pushed the whole idea of interoperability. And a phrase, it's 20 years later, I can use this phrase probably. The phrase he used was, we'll never interoperate, it's IP dilutive. And then a decade or so later, he got sick. And he came back with a vengeance to solve the issues he dealt with himself around chasing records that his doctors couldn't find, and interoperability now became religion, right? So you're exactly right. There is a certain element to that, but I'll also say that a company like Apple doesn't work on, billionaires' whims. A company like Apple is super thoughtful and methodical about the markets it enters and the markets it stays in. I mean, they're not who they are by just tilting at windmills and chasing shiny objects, right? You know this. And so I believe that there's your point about we're going to have the industry we're going to have the most impact on is healthcare. It's clear that they believe that fundamentally, but they also believe that the way they're going to have that impact is by being themselves.
And I was just I completely agree with you. I personally don't think that it is something that they, some of the billionaires themselves have thought of. There is certainly a movement in longevity, not just in tech, but other people that are for themselves interested in longevity, where, by the way, the need is, and I think, Sumit, this is what you're working on, the need is actually extending life, bearable life for people with multiple chronic diseases versus extending somebody's life, that is a super healthy individual. And I do think here in tech, they're very smart. Tech companies, they follow trends. And if you're thinking about, there are only 3 industries where you can make a big impact. It's environment, education, and healthcare. And healthcare, of all of those, I would say environment/energy, healthcare is number 1. It's one of the biggest costs. And so there is a bit of, I would say, hubris, confidence in tech, and there should be, because tech has transformed many industries. Tech has transformed how we live. So I don't see it's a huge leap to say, we've transformed how you work, we've transformed how you live and operate, how you communicate, how you do everything. How do you start a fight? Even how do you start wars? We start that now through tech platforms. So it's not a crazy leap to say, well, you know what, we've done this, now we can change healthcare. And I do think that tech can have enormous potential in healthcare, but there has to be more focus.
Hey everyone, we'll get right back to the conversation after a word from our sponsors. Is your healthcare org a tangled mess of Christmas lights? Your care teams are drowning in manual work, juggling dozens of point solutions and burning out in Excel hell, while your engineers work through a backlog bigger than a surgeon's ego. Awell is here to untangle the mess. Their CareOps orchestration platform lets ops and clinical teams design, implement, and improve care flows in days, integrated seamlessly with your tech stack. The result? Automated processes, fewer soul-sucking tasks, and faster care model improvements. This year alone, Awell has orchestrated over 40 million care activities for leading organizations like Astrana Health, Commons Clinic, and Better Health. Ready to save your team from Excel hell? Visit awellhealth.com. That's AWELL health.com and mention this podcast for a free bootcamp. They'll take you from zero to an implementable workflow in 2 days or less. Awell, the AI-powered CareOps platform.
Sumit, I do wonder if, because I see the same trend of 4 years that Chrissy has mentioned, sometimes I just think they pick a person who wants to have that tech platform and is talking about him or herself for a few years and then realizes, hey, nothing has been done, and then leaves to the next gig. Do you see the same thing? Perhaps that's the thing that, one needs to solve is leadership at these companies and really honing in on the problem and solving it rather than, having a platform flying around and speaking at conferences all day
I think
long.
you're right, Luba. It's been a revolving door. It's worth mentioning that. Like these, we hear all this news about so-and-so tech companies hiring someone, and then they hire the same people over and over again. It's somebody with a big name out of a academic medical center over and over again. And, Sumit, I want to hear your thoughts on this, but like, if you've worked at an AMC and you're a big shot physician, what about that background is well suited to running complex teams at a tech company entering into a new sector? It just seems like almost like you're going to create a lot of friction in that culture right off the bat.
Well, I think that's exactly what happens. So, going back to why do companies enter healthcare in the first place? Why do these folks even get tempted to enter this space that has been so difficult to solve? And it all boils down to it's, for many of them, 18, 20% of GDP is just really, really hard to deal with, right? So that's where it all starts. And when they enter this industry, what they're looking for is to consume a chunk of that GDP, to actually participate in the value creation, rather than solving the cost problem, which is really not creating growth. It's the opposite of creating growth. And the hardship problem, which is really fundamentally changing the cultures of the places where people receive care. Right? Those two things, when you then throw somebody into the mix whose entire career has been about healthcare, that becomes super hard for them to wrap their heads around. The culture problem, we hear culture eats strategy for lunch all the time. Well, that's what goes wrong. Because really, when you come at this big tech, capital base, scale, ingenuity, agility, when you take all of those things together, but then you bring the same culture of healthcare into it, that has in fact been part of the reason why the challenges that we have today exist. It becomes a foregone conclusion almost that you're not going to get to the solution. That's where a lot of these efforts run aground. And your point about personalities is exactly right. People bet on individuals rather than on strategy. And then, of course, the speaking circuit, that's where all of this stuff bombs. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I do want to. There is one outlier, although I am hearing that they are interested in a more general approach. Is NVIDIA? I think so far to date, they've done a fantastic job really sticking to what they know and their strategy, and they are. I've been impressed with many of the investments that they have made and their approach to hone in on really fantastic, I would say, platform biotech technologies that are going to be themselves a platform for many other biotech companies and therefore utilizing NVIDIA's technology. So I think that is a fantastic fit in what they're doing, although I am hearing that they are looking to expand and doing bigger and grander things. And that's when one starts to get a little nervous. And when I say grander, I don't mean expanding and grander within what they're doing, but really, trying to solve everybody's problems again, across the whole entire healthcare continuum. So to date, they have done, I think, a really great job.
Yeah, it goes back to what we started with, staying true to your strengths, finding the adjacency. That's the recipe for success, to enter healthcare by not really entering healthcare. Having an impact on healthcare is really the goal rather than becoming a healthcare company. And I think the ones that do that succeed.
I do want to ask about an IPO, though, that we've all probably been reading about, Waystar. It's obviously not a great time to go public, but I'm sure that company took a haircut on its valuation by opting, whether or not how much of it is a choice, we don't know, but the decision to go out today. And I think just in conversations that I've had with people on Wall Street, what I'm hearing is that we think that's a great company. Like, it has many things about it that should make it a real star. But software investors look at a business like that and they see healthcare and they think this is not a market that we want to be in. It doesn't function like
Yep.
other markets. And this is not like the software companies that we're used to looking at. It has a very different profile. And then the healthcare people look, or you look at a business like that and you're like, well, we would probably give it, we would say this is a healthcare company, but it wants to be a software company. And then you end up in this really awkward place where like nobody really knows how to value these sorts of businesses. So what does that mean for big tech, where you're public companies, you've got to report every quarter, and then you're going into a space that has these really slow sales cycles? It's just like impossible relative to what you see in other industries. It's super regulated. I mean, the issues, you and I, we all know these issues. We could go on and on and on about them, but like, what do you do in that market that's so specific and also so tough?
I think the Waystar story is yet to play out. We don't know how the story ends. Yes, there's an IPO. They're in the revenue cycle management business. Their entire reason to exist is to simplify healthcare payments. And they're a new player. They don't have legacy. And that's their asset. And maybe that's going to be what enables them, with all this capital, to make a real go of it. Maybe that's because they were born to do this, right? They haven't been around for 20, 30 years as a public company. They don't have a business that everyone counts on as a successful business. And then this is seen as the drag. And maybe that's the difference. And going back to a theme, Chrissy, that you and I have talked about frequently, maybe one of these days, this becomes that buy moment for one of the other big companies, right? Maybe these folks succeed, and maybe what happened with One Medical happens with these folks. Maybe that's how big tech actually enters traditional healthcare, because one of these companies pulls it off, and now there's an asset to be acquired.
I think you're right.
Maybe that's really the story
ahead. It's going
to
be big tech, or it's going to be private equity.
Right.
But it's just tough out there.
Yeah, it's tough out there. And there is something to be said that some companies, the majority of companies on healthcare really should not be public. And one would question, and I think a good question is why is this company going public? If the reason you're going public is because you haven't been able to raise money privately, and usually the reason for that is because perhaps your valuation was too high and you're not showing that you can really deliver and scale those revenues to the extent that you can at least have expected higher return, and nobody guarantees anything. So therefore, it's really hard for you to raise privately. And second of all, which is most concerning, is why, if you've done so well, why isn't anyone interested in acquiring you? In biotech space, especially when the markets are good, and even when perhaps public markets are not very good, but when you have a lot of M&A activity as you do today, a lot of companies, biotech companies, have both options on the table. They have option to go public, actually 3 options. They have an option to go public, option to have another raise, or option for an acquisition. What worries me about in health tech, and specifically here, is most likely those other 2 options did not exist for companies like this. And when that's the case, again, it's going to just drag down the value later on, and it's going to hurt other companies that potentially have a type of product or multiple product strategy where they can develop multiple products for the same type of, let's say, a payer, and then potentially be sold not to tech company. I think that if a payer is not interested in acquiring you, I do wonder why. Have you created the kind of value and efficiency that is needed?
So that's a great point, Luba. And I think you're right that those options increasingly just don't exist for a lot of these companies. And many of us hoped that big tech would become the big acquirer, but it has happened in a few cases. We've seen PillPack, we've seen One Medical. Apple's bought a few really small companies, but it hasn't taken on the form that we expected it would, and certainly nothing close to what you see with pharma companies buying these kind of smaller, scrappier biotechs. So I think that is kind of not materialized in the way that we would have hoped as an industry, because it's fundamentally a good thing for the world of health tech.
Yep.
And right now, I often say I think we're about to enter into the season of the down round, because if the IPO window is not open, these acquisitions are not happening, then you've got to go back to the private markets to raise money. And, so many of these companies are just overvalued from that kind of pandemic era. So, all in, I think we're not looking at a good period coming up for a lot of these growth stage businesses. And it's unfortunate that big tech seems to still be thinking that they can build it themselves rather than buy, because I haven't seen that strategy play out either.
Yeah, and what else is interesting is it's not, there is another industry that's very similar. So a lot of the times in health tech, in digital health, companies think, oh, we're the first ones that this happened to. But no, look, there is an industry called diagnostics that's been around for many, many years. And it has, I'd be very curious, Sumit, you've been in Accenture, if you think the same, but it's been around forever, and they've had this issue for a long, long time. And one of the reasons is because we don't pay for prevention. And a lot of diagnostics is about prevention. A lot of diagnostics is also about, once there's a disease, managing the disease, and we don't pay for that either. So it's very, very similar to digital health, and it's been years. There was a little uptake when we had, of course, the sequencing of the genome. There was a lot of sequencing companies when we had Illumina and actually built a cheaper, faster sequencer. But even with all of that, to date, it's in the same place. You don't have diagnostic companies going public or having a big rah-rah moment. The people that build diagnostic companies that are successful, if you look very carefully, they are not promising, we're going to transform things. They start very small. They get approval for one test and they get approval for another. Not just approval, it's that it show clinical evidence after clinical evidence, show adoption after adoption, show reimbursement. It's the same exact thing as in health tech. So the question is recognizing that you're not in the biotech industry. You have a different North Star to align yourself with, basically.
Yeah, clinical medical diagnostics, my company before I went to Accenture was in that business. And everything that you just said is true. It's a brutal business, and it's even more brutal to scale. And every single step is surrounded by regulatory challenges. And they're all there for a reason. They're all there because you're dealing with people's lives and you have to get it right. And so you have to go through testing and validation and proving that the stuff works and that it's accurate. The only model that really seems to work in that industry is the printer cartridge model, where ultimately you're hoping for a test or a series of tests that becomes so commonplace that they scale, and that's your revenue. You sell the analyzers, you even give them away because you're selling the tests, and that's what you're getting paid by test, right? That's really the business. And every one of these companies that has then tried to pivot towards outcomes, towards prevention, towards early detection, the only place where they're seeing actual traction is where they've gone direct to consumer. They're not seeing that traction come from the provider industry. That tells you a lot. The incentives are fundamentally aligned. It's very, very hard to have a conversation with a provider that involves convincing them that it's a good thing to take out their top line, to reduce their revenue, because they've now solved a cost problem. They've prevented people from being hospitalized because it's better for them and it's better for the economy. And they're shutting down wings and beds. There's no hospital CEO, or very few, who wants to be the person on whose watch that happened. It's all about growth, even in that industry. And so you take all of this, you take diagnostics and you take how the provider industry works, and then you talk about cost takeout, and there's just no alignment. And you can see that play itself out even now every single day with how we're paying for value-based anything, right? We're not really. It's not really happening. When you look at Medicare Advantage and all the pushback that's happening because the rates are now changing. Well, we all knew that was going to happen, and we all planned for it, but this is the reality, and it doesn't feel good for the folks providing the service. You were going to say something, Luba.
No, I was just going to say, I absolutely agree. It's so interesting. You made me think of a lot of companies, for example, in health tech that are building out commercial teams. It's the same question as when you're building out commercial teams as in diagnostics is you can't bring in a big pharma or pharma person to build out and be a commercial person in diagnostics, the same way that many in health tech are looking into, oh, well, there's a wonderful pharma person, let's bring them in. And it's it's an entirely different business. It's a different business model, who you sell to, how you sell, the reception and understanding of that clinical workflow, and physician adoption is so important because physician adoption is different with drugs. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I do think that health tech companies, I think, could learn quite a lot, not just from strategy, but also from just building out teams in the right way and identifying the right phenotype for their teams.
I'll give you an interesting fact about Cherish. When we created it, we actually named, before we had a name, we called it Follow the Money, FTM Solutions, for this exact reason. Because we said wasn't about greed, it was about, we're not going to solve cost in healthcare without knowing the incentives that drive the flow of money. And once you figure that out around a use case, then you have a chance to actually affect it, or you actually have a chance to, having understood it, say, well, that's not going to change. Let's not waste our time and money there, right? I mean, that's the reality that very, very few companies go through. And that's why we see this pile up 2-3 years later with a personality driving a big tech or a big telco or big retail into an industry without really following the money. And then, of course, the pilot.
I love that.
Chrissy.
That's a perfect note to end on. Luba, you and I are going to chit chat. We're going to say goodbye to our friend Sumit. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a really good conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And I think some of the highlights,
Always
it
fun.
was a lot of fun.
It was a lot. It was fantastic.
Lots of highlights, but my favorite is FTM, Follow the Money. So I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna share it with a few companies that I speak to. It's great, and yeah, the world works that way. So I think the sooner that we appreciate it, as messed up as it may be, the sooner we can start building companies that work.
And what's wonderful also having you on it is also just seeing in this space how important it is to have your type of perspective and experience where you've been across the healthcare continuum. So you understand healthcare and the needs and what works and what doesn't, and the dream, which is wonderful, but also the reality so well. So thank you so much for taking the time and talking to us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So what did you think about that conversation with Sumit? I think he's seen a lot of different tech companies kind of try and fail. So I was keen to kind of get his take, and I thought he delivered. I think he was spot on.
Oh, absolutely. After we chatted with Sumit, I think his background, because he's also been across the different aspects and different parts of healthcare, it really came through, because you have to see it from the perspective of tech. You have to understand it from perspective of healthcare. And also, if you've been like he has in the diagnostic space or in the biotech space, it makes you understand really what works and what doesn't. So and he was also in consulting as well. So I really enjoyed the discussion. And I know we didn't really get a chance to talk about what he's doing right now. Perhaps we can have him back next time, because I do find that the work that he's doing is important and is going to be, really fantastic for, monitoring patients at home.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should have him back and talk about it. Maybe show us the device in action. And, I think hardware is an area that's just undervalued, I would say, because it's just, associated with being very challenging, the manufacturing issues and so forth. But, I think there's real opportunity, especially as we see this kind of move to the home, just continue to accelerate with the aging population that you mentioned. And this is something that, I could see a company like an Apple or Google taking an interest in, because both these companies have also signaled that they recognize that there is this shift. And, we're going to need this whole new generation of sensor-based technology to be able to kind of keep people safe while they're in these environments that I think they would prefer to be in. Nobody wants to be in the hospital. Nobody wants to be in a facility. You want to be at home. It's exactly spot on what he's building, and it kind of speaks to all that. And everything he said about big tech, I think, is right too. And hopefully this was just kind of a whole big opportunity to learn, and that whatever we see next is gonna be kind of better than what's come before.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned the hardware, and I do think that if I were to start a health tech company, I would probably do it in the hardware space. And the reason for that is if you're looking at what has been successful, and successful, I mean the company either has been bought or the technology has been utilized, the technology has been reimbursed, and widely implemented. It really is in the hardware space. So think about, for example, the AFib detection that we have on our Apple Watch. Think about the continuous glucose monitors, the CGMs. They have been very successful. And we just don't have enough approaches like this. But there's a huge demand. So one of the things that Sumit said is, as you said, follow the money, which I also loved, is if you're thinking about it, the best application right now, in addition to, of course, monitoring patients and helping patients, is in clinical trial. And I can assure you that there are many companies and pharma companies that would love to continuously monitor patients that are in clinical trials to understand how they respond to drugs, both for safety purposes and for efficacy purposes. So there's tons of money out there to not only get paid for this great technology, but also test out the technology and improve on it. I'm sure we all have been, had aches and pains and have gone to the doctor and, remember, something was painful or something hurt. And then by the time you get to the doctor, you get that appointment, you don't even remember why you're there, and you're, in between appointments or meetings and stepping out of work. And we forget, we don't continuously monitor what is happening. We also forget what exactly is ailing us. This is a technology that can help with everything from making better drugs and monitoring patients in clinical trials, but also monitoring patients with chronic diseases, and also diagnostics and understanding. There's a huge percentage, actually, Chrissy, we should look into it. What's the percentage of patients that are misdiagnosed? I think that's a pretty high number.
Really high.
So I think, maybe
we should, the number one reason for medical malpractice lawsuits is just delayed misdiagnoses.
Exactly. And you could cut down on that with simple tracking, with simple continuous monitors. And we have the sensors. So the sensors, the technology is not that difficult. The type of sensors we have today are really high end, and just incorporating them in a device for particular use is really what's needed. So technologically, I don't think there are any barriers. And I think from regulatory standpoint of view, you follow the same med device, but not everywhere. You don't need it, for example, if you're going into clinical trials monitoring. So I would encourage, our audience, if you're interested in startups and, hardware, to do that.
Absolutely. Well, I think sometimes we over obsess with software. We love to talk about AI, but we forget about things like hardware technology. We forget about the sensors, and, they sort of come and go in these hype cycles. But what you said is bang on. It's dead on. I could see real practical applications in healthcare today for a lot of new hardware technology, whereas, some of this AI stuff that we're talking about feels like it's a decade or two out for me. So, back to big tech. I think there's opportunities in both. And I hope to see kind of some of these companies coming back in and maybe doing things that are not just like cool technologies looking for applications, but are really solving true pain points in healthcare. So thanks for joining, Luba. It was fun.
Wonderful. All righty.
Thanks for tuning in to Second Opinion. Share it with colleagues and friends and message us to let us know what topics you want to discuss on the podcast. If you want to support the show, the best ways are to leave a review wherever you're listening and make sure you are subscribed. And check out Chrissy's Substack, Second Opinion. A link to subscribe is in the episode description. Second Opinion is part of Turpentines, the podcast network behind Turpentine VC, Age of Miracles, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.
There's no shortage of podcasts and deep dives into the secrets of VC. But the truth is that the world's best venture firms and GPs at their helm still remain an enigma. VC is as much of an art as it is a science. Other shows focus on the now of venture or even the last 10 years. But what separates the most enduring and generation-defining firms is the subject of a podcast called Turpentine VC from the Turpentine Podcast Network. On this season of the show, you'll hear from Ben Horowitz, Alfred Lin, Mahmoud Hamid, and more. Subscribe to Turpentine VC for the rare and revealing conversations that can only be had investor to investor.